Jay Michaelson has stopped by to visit with us at the Democratic National Convention. We're glad to see him. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
You're such a good thinker. I'm going to do something I don't think I've ever done with you, and that is I want to first ask you what you're feeling. What have you observed, and what are the feelings that go with it?
Well, I think for me, there is kind of a narrative that's happened, I think, of a little disunity at the beginning and some coming together as we've gone on. I think part of that obviously was resolving, some of the mistreatment that Bernie and his supporters received from the party. And I feel like although we'll never really make up for some of that, I think there's been some coming together. Been a lot of really high-profile Bernie supporters now very strongly endorsing Hillary, not holding their nose in voting, but actually, really saying what's good and progressive about her. I saw Keith Ellison, for example, Representative Keith Ellison this morning, who gave a really impassioned statement. I think that's part of it. I think the second part is that I think there was just a hangover from the darkness of the Republican convention. This wasn't just another Republican convention. It wasn't Mitt Romney that they were nominating. This was something where people were calling for our candidate, the Democratic candidate, to be shot or to be imprisoned, and chants going on, and openly fascistic imagery used in the nomination process. And I think there was a little bit of a hangover. So the feeling that I get now is that now that we're rolling on this convention, a little bit of retaking the narrative. We're in a bubble here. I don't know what it's like out there in the rest of the world, and that's why it's fun to be in this bubble. Yeah. But here I do feel that there's a constructive, positive message that's coming through. I think President Bill Clinton's message last night, was very spiritual in nature and almost like a pastor's, sermon a little bit. It's kind of a very folksy telling of his own personal story. Obviously, Michelle Obama's speech the previous night, took the House down. And so I feel like there's a little bit more of a positive narrative, at least from my perception. Yeah.
Okay, now I do want you to talk about what you think about what's going on.
So, I think in a certain way, I just did a piece actually for the Forward talking about two elephants in the room. I think the second one maybe we've dealt with. Those two are kind of ISIS and Islamism, and the second being Hillary Clinton's own popularity issues. There were some very weird elephants in the room back in the Elephants Convention last week. You would almost think like Black Lives Matter wasn't a thing or racial justice wasn't a thing. And, there were just all these issues that were never spoken of. Here I have seen a little less attention given to some of the real security concerns that a lot of Americans have. And I think that's going to change tonight, tomorrow night, as it comes in the themes on the floor. But I do think there's a weird cognitive dissonance that's happening, that a lot of what America is concerned about, we're not necessarily talking about because it's not on message for the Democratic Party. I think the second elephant in the room for me was Hillary Clinton's negatives, and I think Bill Clinton addressed that a little bit last night, and I know other speakers will and have as well. Just actually trying to say, look, there's two narratives out there, and Bill Clinton said very clearly, one's true and one's false. Probably the truth is somewhere a little bit of each, but I think that's important for us to think about, and I was glad to see that elephant in the room at least talked about. But I do think there's an air of unreality. A lot of the sessions that I've gone to is at the Faith Panel and the Jewish Roundtable and LGBT Roundtable. Sometimes it's like in an alternate universe where we're not living under the envelope of encroaching fascism.
Yes.
And so anytime we get out of that bubble, it feels good.
I want to stay with Hillary's problem just for a little bit. Would you have handled that the way she has? I mean, basically, she has said very little about it. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, she's got better, more experienced political advisors than I, but it does not strike me as very authentic to just ignore the main concern, especially because I think there are legitimate answers to that. My take on Hillary's negatives is that it's a combination of sexism on the one hand and 30 years of Republican attacks on the other. I think we as a culture have certain assumptions or judgments about what authenticity sounds like and what reliability sounds like. There was that great sketch on Jimmy Kimmel a couple of months ago where he was mansplaining to Hillary how to talk and how to act and how to speak. And you live with that for 20, 30 years. Some people are going to feel that you're inauthentic because you've been coached and prodded and pushed so much. And she's her own person, but I think it's inevitable that some of those very gendered understandings, sexist understandings of what it is to be, a good old boy, that affects her. And I think that's a strong answer. I don't think that's, and I think Bill Clinton talked about that a little bit more on the Republican attack side, that they've created this fantasy image. I'd like Hillary to take the bull by the horns and recognize that there are a lot of people who have a fundamental mistrust of her and point to her record, her actual record, not the fictional one, and really call people out and come up with specific, examples. The fact that the Republican Party wants us to focus on a couple of emails when their candidate has had 600 lawsuits and allegations of fraud at every stage of his career, is just unbelievable. And even if there was some a lapse in judgment, as Hillary Clinton's admitted on this email thing, it's so minuscule compared to what we're talking about. And that's before all of this stuff, Donald Trump arguably just committed treason today, calling for a foreign president to hack, the Democratic Party.
Right.
And that is every time we think he's off the charts, he finds a new chart to get off of. But that's a felony,
yes.
And he's not going to be prosecuted for it, but that is a felony.
Yeah.
And so the fact that, I think we could take the bull by the horns a little bit and really make this case, like we see the concern. And same thing on terrorism. We see the fear that's here. The fear is there. We may say it's out of proportion or this or that, but the fear is real. And I think on this side, there are a lot of good people with good answers to that and how to work with that. And I think it would be a mistake to leave that on the table.
I think so too. I was going to ask you that, but let me skip to another one that I just want your thoughts on. Why does Black Lives Matter stir such a multitude of emotions?
Well, it's, speaking from my own white privilege perspective, I think, there is something, if you don't have that concept of white privilege in your head, there is something odd about saying, well, why do some people's lives matter and some people's don't? Obviously, that's not what Black Lives Matter means. They're one of the many memes that have gone around about trying to explain the phrase Black Lives Matter is like, if you're at a table and everybody's getting a helping of food and one person's not, it's not saying, you're not being anti the other people to say, hey, give Jimmy some food. And then everyone's like, well, all people should get food. Well, no, that's not the point. The point is that that there are some lives that are deemed not to matter. And that's why we have to say Black Lives. Nobody has to say Blue Lives Matter, because we as a culture value police officers' lives, as we should.
Sure.
Right? That's why we don't have to say that. And I do think that there's a certain, there's that quote that goes around in various different forums that when you've had privilege for so long, equality looks like discrimination. And I know what that's like. I grew up in a very privileged white environment. I grew up in Tampa, Florida in the 1980s. And the people I saw on TV screens were white and movie screens were white. And I think I can imagine what people say when they when they say make America great again. Like, go back to that when I was in charge and people looked like me everywhere. And there was no Spanish on the phone tree and I didn't have to worry about quote unquote political correctness. I could be as offensive as I wanted to be as long as I was in charge. And we need to get into that a little bit deeper. And it's funny, I think not a lot of people I talk to know that, I have these two careers, the one's political and the other spiritual. This year it's felt like it's the same thing. There are these profound spiritual anxieties that are in our country right now, and they're being expressed in the worst of white supremacy and hatred and fear. And it's really striking to me how transparent that is. How a group of people is afraid of losing their position of power. And they are losing their position of power in a certain way, right? We are becoming slowly we are becoming a more multicultural society. And that fear is turning into just the worst kind of hatred. And, every so often it feels like the same things that I'm saying on my meditation retreats that I lead, about notice the fear and don't be captured by it, somehow seems like a political slogan. It's very bizarre to have to feel like we're having this psychodrama on a national scale, and it's not just us. Obviously, it's Britain as well. Throughout Europe, nativism and nationalism, resurgent Islamophobia all over the place.
Right.
And I think that we do need to recognize that fear is real. It might not be justified. It might not be moral, but it is there. And I think there are a lot of folks on the Democratic side who do have ways to work with that. And we need to step up. And we need to stop pretending that, half of America isn't scared right now. and address it.
That's why those two professions that you have and expertise in both of them, and then what you've said tonight, that's why I wanted to know what you felt and what you thought, and it's helpful to know that.
Well, thank you. At the end of every one of our conversations, I end up, promoting you and saying that, this is what we do need a kind of spiritual progressive voice more out there, because we're dealing with a spiritual crisis right now. And I'm not saying religious necessarily.
No,
I don't think we have to go into a narrow definition of what that means.
Right.
But there is a profound sense of dislocation and loss.
Yes.
And, if we don't recognize that, we're not going to be able to address it. And the other side has figured out how to bring together the spiritual and the political, right? Scaring the hell out of everyone and saying there's one big, father figure who's going to make us safe, Comrade Stalin or otherwise.
Right.
Interestingly, I did see a little of that last night in Bill Clinton's speech on the positive side, saying how the issues that he and Hillary have cared about for 40 years are not just kind of a laundry list of liberal concerns, but were part of their spiritual quest for justice. Now, how true that is or not, I'm not going to go into that. But as a message, as a narrative, I think that's a compelling narrative, because it's not just about, a living wage here and, recycling there, but it's actually about justice. And I just wish that the word justice and social justice hadn't been turned into a swear word. It's like when Mike Dukakis had to say he wasn't a liberal because liberal was a dirty word. Right. I wish we wouldn't be afraid to say that we're the party for justice.
Right.
And we have different views of what that means, and that's healthy and robust. And I think the Sanders camp has a lot to say, and I think the Clinton camp has a lot to say. But we do have something to say about justice, and that's not making America great again back when we had Jim Crow or sexism or homophobia. I think there was a beautiful line Bill Clinton said that, our greatness has to be in the future, because we're trying to create a more perfect union. And to me, that's what spirituality and justice work are all about.
So it's a long time till November. We're going to have a lot of time to talk, and
God
I
help
look
us.
forward to it.
All right,
Thank you,
you,
man.
Thank you.